mentioned about the need for change. What is Singapore's role in terms of convincing member countries or even your counterparts to change the multilateral trading system? And when you speak to your peers, what are they saying about all of this?
There is general recognition amongst all the countries that participated in the G20 this year that the global economic and financial architecture needs to be refreshed. And in particular, the WTO, which is at the center of the multilateral trading system, needs an urgent reform. Because the system that we had before was optimized around trade efficiency, and today countries are putting more weight on resilience and security. And so we will need to find a new balance in order to accommodate these new strategic realities. And even global institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, which were put in place decades ago, needs a refresh to reflect today's strategic realities too. So in theory, in principle, countries understand the imperatives for change, but countries will also have different views on what to change, what specifically to change, how the rules should be updated. And that's where it gets very complex, because without consensus or with so many different views, we may not be able to find a common path forward. But nevertheless, even if there are these differences, that should not stop us from trying, from continuing to engage with one another in platforms like the G20 and others, so as to hopefully narrow the gaps where there are differences and gradually evolve towards a better arrangement.
I think you also mentioned, you give some examples like FITP and then the CPTPP, EU and ASEAN dialogues as being helpful in encouraging trade flow. How has all these things benefited Singapore so far, and what's the next step?
So the different approaches we are taking are really complementary approaches to try and figure out how best to move forward in refreshing and revamping the entire global multilateral system. It's partly, of course, it's reforming the institutions themselves, whether the WTO, which I mentioned, there's a process for that, or even through the IMF and World Bank and these different institutions. So one effort is to go through the institutions themselves. But where trade is concerned, another parallel effort is to work through plurilaterals, minilaterals, like the FITP, which we have started amongst like-minded countries, and also with different regional groupings like the CPTPP and the EU. So these parallel efforts are not so much about just encouraging trade flows or keeping trade open, but discussing amongst like-minded countries where there is hopefully easier to get consensus in order to develop these new rules around supply chain resilience, around better ways of facilitating trade and investments, digital trade, which requires new rules too, or for that matter, harmonizing standards. So all these efforts are useful.
So this G20 actually happened at the backdrop with global tension and also the tensions surrounding G20 Summit itself. So how would you comment on the summit? Was it successful? Whatever achieved, do you think it'll be effective moving forward? What is the takeaway from the summit?
Yes, there are tensions. The global environment is such that these geopolitical differences, tensions, rivalries will always be at the backdrop all the time from now onwards. This is the new normal. They're not going to go away. But does that mean we should stop talking, stop engaging? I think the answer is, in fact, we need more platforms to come together to find ways to engage with one another. And in this regard, I think this year's G20 has been a tremendous success. South Africa, of course, is very proud of what it has achieved because this is the first G20 summit on African soil. But so too are all the African countries who participated actively in this. And I'm glad we were able to get a declaration amongst all the countries. And there is a sense, as I mentioned just now, amidst the differences, yes, there are differences, but still some consensus on the way forward. And from that point of view, I think it's been a very fruitful outcome.
So on the outcomes, the G20 pushed
forward with a declaration this year without the US's input. And what does this tell us about the dynamics of such a multilateral groupings? I think some of the media reports have been suggesting that it seems to show that such groupings can function even without the US. What are your views on this?
We are in a transition to a multipolar world. I've said that before. But even in the midst of this transition, I think we should recognize that not all poles are the same. They are not all equal. America is, for now, still the biggest pole. And obviously, American leadership is vital in providing that global framework for the world. So the preference from Singapore's point of view, of course, is for America to be actively engaged in all of these discussions in shaping the way forward. But if America is not involved or chooses not to be involved, that should not stop the rest of the world from coming together and finding ways on our own to guide the direction forward or to find a way forward amongst ourselves. And if America is ready to join the conversation and discussion later, they can do so at any time. So that's our thinking and that's our approach. And that's why I think even without America's participation, the G20 Summit this year has been useful and productive. But obviously, if we continue to have further discussions on economic issues, on trade issues, we would want to have America's involvement because their leadership, their active participation is vital. And since, especially when America is going to be the chair of G20 next year, we look forward to the agenda which they have set, which is centered around growth, which will be important for countries everywhere.
And PM, my question is a bit related. It's also about American participation, but you mentioned the reform of WTO. So how much can we reform global trade rules without the US on board? And also, how would you rate the likelihood of it happening and the time needed for this reform?
It's going to be complex. It's going to be a lengthy process. Even with the US involved, it's going to be a very lengthy process. And if America is not involved in that for now, I think we just have to be realistic. It doesn't mean we should give up, but we should still persist with the different efforts which I highlighted just now. Part of it, as I mentioned, is through reforming the WTO itself, and that includes things like the decision-making process within the WTO, finding ways for the dispute settlement process to get started again. So all these are processes within the WTO, but the parallel efforts, as I mentioned, are also important, whether through FITP, whether it's through the EU CPTPP partnerships that we are discussing. As I said, these parallel efforts are ways in which you can get amongst like-minded countries platforms for thinking about how new rules, new frameworks are to be developed amongst ourselves first. And eventually, if they are successful, they can provide a basis for other countries to join, be part of these platforms, and for us to extend the rules across the board as part of WTO precepts.
Okay, yeah, we're talking about Africa,
Yes.
Singapore, Africa, Thailand.
Yeah.
I think one of the programs that was launched today is SAPLINGS.
Yes.
In terms of skill exchange, how does Singapore actually benefit from this?
Indirectly, but I think we also have, it's not just so seen through a narrow lens of whether Singapore benefits or not, but I think for us as a country, having come this far, having developed and progressed this far, we do want to help others succeed as well. And the way we do it is by sharing our experience and helping to build up capabilities in other countries. So whether it's through skills, whether it's through our Singapore Cooperation Program, or in Africa's case, we are putting together a new package called SAPLINGS. All these are ways in which we can make a contribute to other countries, provide value to them, because there's a lot of interest amongst them to learn from us, so we share our experiences, and we hope by doing so, these countries will be able to progress, develop their economies, grow their economies, and as their economies expand and grow, it will provide opportunities for Singapore companies, for businesses for Singaporeans in these new markets as well. So yes, overall, it enlarges the pie, increases the markets, provides us more space to operate. So overall, it benefits Singapore. But at the end of the day, I think it's also our responsibility as a responsible global citizen to do our part to help others succeed.
I think that being said, when we sign MOU, when we strengthening bilateral ties, I think Singaporeans do tend to ask the question, so how does it benefit Singapore?
Naturally.
And also, how does it reflect in a tangible way for
Yes.
Singaporeans? So how will this, what will this be for this round?
For Ethiopia, the economy is growing, a lot of potential. It's a place where our businesses are not so familiar, Ethiopia or Africa for that matter. So I think it's one of the ways in which we can, by strengthening our links with Ethiopia and with Africa more broadly, expand the space for companies, for Singapore-based enterprises to operate in a more challenging global environment. The familiar markets, our companies already know how to do business there. But if we want to grow, if we want to expand, we have to we can't just stick to the familiar markets. We have to look at new areas. And these new frontier areas are in places like Africa. Africa is not so familiar to our companies. Perhaps the ease of doing business, the familiarity is not the same as places nearer to Singapore. But there is tremendous potential in Africa. If you look at population-wise, the entire African continent is more than 1.5 billion people. If you look at population growth, this is the region in the world that is growing. Many other regions are not growing. So if you project 10, 20, 30 years from now, Africa could have 2 million, 2 billion, 3 billion people. It's a very sizable market. So for us to start building these links so that our businesses can start to come in, enter the market, familiarize themselves, and hopefully over time get to understand business conditions here and grow their presence here. I think this will provide more opportunities in the longer term for both Singapore businesses and also Singaporeans looking to venture abroad.
Because earlier I actually spoke to Mr. Hua from Wilmar, Singapore, and he actually said, this is a great opportunity for Singapore businesses to venture out, right, into Africa. But he also said there are some challenges, like, navigating the politics of Africa and stuff like that. So I'm just wondering, will they be receiving, for businesses that are keen, how will they be supported?
Enterprise Singapore continues to support all our businesses when they go overseas. We can't do everything for businesses. There are risks. There are changes in the political conditions if governments were to change. These are realities not just in Africa. These are realities even in Southeast Asia. But these are things that businesses have to understand, and they will have to adapt to these realities of operating abroad. Understandably, Africa is a new area for many businesses, not so familiar. They are not so familiar with doing business here. But I think as we build up these links, as we have more diplomatic missions here, and we are going to set up one here in Ethiopia, we will certainly facilitate more business delegations, more visits here, and over time with more interactions, perhaps our businesses will better understand the conditions, will also better understand the specific opportunities that fit their needs. Because not every business may find it suitable, but there will be some who find a good match between what they are able to offer and the market conditions here in Africa. And so we hope with more effort, with more presence here in Ethiopia and eventually in other African countries, there will be better potential matches with our companies. And at the same time, we will continue to support companies as they expand and scale up and go overseas. We already have a lot of support schemes in place, and through the economic review strategy process that's ongoing, the team that's looking at this is continuing to see how we can better support our companies when they expand abroad.
PM, you have been emphasizing a lot on the need to work with like-minded partners to help build a new global architecture. Given that Singapore is a small country and Africa at this point still has quite a limited geopolitical influence, how can Singapore and Africa work together towards this goal?
Well, we should, not dismiss the efforts of small countries or countries with seemingly limited geopolitical influence, because at the end of the day, these efforts can all add up. If more and more countries, you start small, whether it's Africa, whether it is in Asia, whichever the region, but as long as we begin somewhere, as we did with the P4 in the past, which was 4 smallish economies, and eventually that became the CPTPP. So similarly, in many of these efforts, whether it's FITP or other things, it doesn't matter whether you're small or big, whether you have geopolitical influence or not. I think it's what matters more is if the economies come together, we find a good platform to innovate and try something new, be it on digital trade, on supply chain resilience. The success will then speak for itself, because when we are able to do something different and it's impactful and it's effective for the few of us who are involved, others will come knocking on the door. And this has been the case for P4, as I described just now, and even now when we do FITP, we have a few more interested countries saying we would like to join. So that's how we can get these conversations and engagements growing into tangible outcomes. I would say another thing about Africa and Singapore is that Ethiopia and Singapore, it's not just about the bilateral efforts, but we also see a lot of potential in bringing our two regions closer together, whether it's East Africa or, for that matter, the entire African continent together with Southeast Asia. Right? So that's an ASEAN. ASEAN is also working very hard to strengthen its links with different regions. That's why we've been talking to the EU. Canada is also interested. And that shows, again, ASEAN has convening power. ASEAN has many countries, many regions are interested to talk to ASEAN now. EU, Canada, GCC, we've been doing more to build these sorts of linkages, particularly in this changing global environment. And I think Africa will also be an interesting area for us to explore further.
Oh, PM, okay. My question is more about you than about your policies. You have this unenviable job of taking Singapore forward globally during a very fractious time. And we've heard you talk so much about how Singapore does it and our efforts. But I wonder, what are your personal approaches to establishing relations with other world leaders?
The personal rapport can help, right? When you interact with other global leaders, you build a relationship. Okay, all right. The personal rapport can be helpful when I engage with other leaders in different settings. You get to know them, I get to know them, you build a relationship, and then in time it becomes a friendship. And that can be very helpful, of course. But at the end of the day, we must also be clear that foreign policy is built not on friendship, it's built on interest. Countries operate on the basis of their own national interests. That's what foreign policy is about. It's not on the basis of personal relationships. So when countries engage with one another, if we in Singapore engages with another country and there is a broad alignment in our strategic thinking, in our views and perspectives of the world, that makes for, that provides a lot of potential for us to do more things together. And that's why we have strategic partnerships, and we have launched more strategic partnerships with several countries just in this year alone. And of course, on top of the substance, having that personal relationship, as I said, can be very helpful. Then we can resolve differences faster, we can come to agreement quicker, but the substance of what we do together has to be underpinned by shared interest. And that's what matters most of all.